The central theme in Seminar 19, from start to finish, is neither masculinity, nor femininity, nor even sexuation, but the one. We've encountered lots of ones in this series, but the primary orienting ones have been those S1s in Lacan's theory of discourse, particularly his theories of the discourse of the master and the discourse of the analyst. Now, these are not the final ones we're going to consider here in our concluding commentary on Seminar 19. And let me tell you, the ones we've got in store for this final concluding commentary are wildly interesting, but also remarkably familiar. Nevertheless, I think we'd be remiss not to start with those S1s of master and analyst that we've discussed. Recall, and if you like, draw the basic structures of each discourse. And I'll draw them with you. In the case of the master, you've got S1 in the position of agent, addressing S2, producing objet A, and all of this at the behest of a barred subject in the position of truth. Here is the basic structure that I'm holding up for you for the master's discourse. And this is interesting because if you want to think about this in terms of masculinity, you might say that the formula that says all men are castrated subject to the phallic function, there's your barred subject, the truth of every masculine subject. And then you've got this image of S1 that you could correlate with the other formula for masculine enjoyment that says there is one whose enjoyment is not determined by the phallic function. So you can play around with that. I think you could make a lot of good headway with the master's discourse in this regard and that S1. I do, however, also believe that you could take the capitalist discourse and make a lot of good sense with how masculine subjectivities operate. We haven't talked about that, but it's there, it's present throughout all of this. And if you want to know how it works, you take the master's discourse, the left-hand side, that S1 over barred subject, and you simply turn it upside down in a way that breaks the arrow of addressivity and inverts the causality. Now you have a barred subject sitting atop an S1 with the arrow pointed down, not up. Draw it out, you'll see what I mean. And what you get is effectively a little go-kart track of consumerism. I dare say many masculine subjects and feminine subjects alike find themselves there. But that's not what I came to talk to you about. I wanted to talk to you about first these two broad discourses, that of the master and the analyst, and those S1s in there. So you just saw what we're doing with the master's discourse. Let's take one more pass at the analyst discourse, certainly not our last. Here you have objet A in the position of agent, addressing the barred subjectivity of the analysand, and producing symptomatic expressions in the form of S1, all at the behest of a multifarious S2. I hold it up now for you all to see. Here is the discourse of the analyst. You know it very well. My point is, notice those S1s. In the case of the master's discourse, as you know, the phrase that would correspond with this S1 might be something like this. There is one, not two, and it is me, not you. There is one, not two, the master says, and it is me, not you. On the other side, in the case of the analytic discourse, that S1 sounds quite a bit different, as we've learned in this series. If it had a bumper sticker or a slogan, it might say this: there are at least two, not just one, and I'm not the one on which to focus. And you'll recall how we arrived at that. The symptom is the part of truth that can be said, And the unconscious is the part of truth that cannot be said. And when the symptom pops up, it always says, refuse me because I'm not it. The unconscious that commands me is where it's at. I'm not the one. That's what the symptom says again and again and again. I'm not it. I'm not the one. I'm just the part of the one that can be spoken. So you see how the difference is playing out here. In the logic of the master, there is one, not two. But in the case of analytic experience, when the truth of the master gets a chance to speak, what they admit, what they cough up by way of admission is, in fact, there are at least two, not just one, and I'm not the one on which to focus. If the master says, obey me because I am it, the symptom, that S1 in the case of the analytic discourse says, refuse me because I'm not it. The S1 of the master says, obey me because there is only one, not two, and I am it. The symptom in the case of the analytic discourse says, refuse me because there are at least two, not just this one, and I'm not the one on which we should be focused. I think the discourse of the master has been the real centerpiece of Lacan's thinking here in Seminar 19. And I say that because it's very typical of him from Seminar 17 forward. Yes, he's focused on the discourse of the analyst. The analytic discourse is the central discourse, but he spends so much time talking about its other side, the discourse of the master. And when he's talking about the discourse of the master, you have to hear how he's also referring back to the discourse of the analyst. Now, thankfully, he's also quite explicit about the discourse of the analyst in all of this, so that's extremely helpful. But let me just try and put some final captions on this discourse of the master, because it has been such a central part in seminars 17 up through here, the second seminar 19. When masculine masters step up to the mic, I think it's fair to say that they're always trying to break free from their totalization as castrated subjects in the formula that says all male enjoyment, all masculinized enjoyment is subject to the phallic function. Now remember, this ain't got shit to do with you and your swimsuit zone. This has to do with how you enjoy. Folks with vulvas can enjoy according to the masculine structure. Folks with penises can enjoy according to the masculine structure. This is not about anatomy. It's about enjoyment. Structure, even more than anything you experience as self, I would say. The masculine master, whether male or female, is always trying to break free from this 100% of your enjoyment occurs according to the phallic function, this universal set, and enter into, instead, that more powerful, phantasmatic position of a father figure, the one who exists and can say no to the phallic function, the one whose enjoyment eludes and evades the phallic function. Notice the move here. It's a fantasy and a hope, a wager, a gambit that you could get from all oneness to aloneness. And if you want to write this out and put the little dashes in there so you can see the ones popping, you have all-one-ness at the level of the formula that says all masculine enjoyment is subject to the phallic function. And then you have this sense of aloneness, A-L-O-N-E-N-E-S-S. Aloneness that would characterize this phantasmatic figure of a real, exceptional man. And remember what I mean by this. Aloneness at the level of autonomy. At the end of Seminar 19, Lacan seems tempted to discuss this further with his coinage of the term unigation. It's a great little term. It's pretty self-explanatory. I don't think we need a lot of spend much time with it. But it captures this move This masculine fantasy of slipping from a universalization in the field of phallic enjoyment to a unigation, a unigatory possibility or authority, you might say, in this refutation of castrative logics. You can check it out. It's toward the end. The key term here is unigate. It's a verb that means to unify and also to negate at the same time. And I think you can do a lot of good work with it, but it's work that by other means, I believe, we've already done here. So I want to conclude differently. I want to think about some different stuff here. And I want to conclude, or at least start this process by reminding you of some shit you already know. I want to remind you that although the S1s in the discourse of the master and the discourse of the analyst are different in exactly the ways I just told you, the Bard-castrated subjectivities that produce these S1s are the same. The Bard subjectivity in the position of truth in the discourse of the master that causes or conditions this claim that there is oneness and I am it is the same Bard subjectivity that you see in the position of other in the discourse of the analyst, who speaks in symptomatic expressions. Not always, of course, but whose speech, when it rises to the level of the symptom, becomes wildly significant. It's the same Bard subject. The S1s are different. The S1s are doing different things. But the Bard subject speaks, in the case of the analyst, precisely what that of the master tries to silence. And let me try and be precise with this. I believe that the suppressed and silenced truth of the master's agency and authority to proclaim oneness for himself is the very one who speaks freely in symptomatic expressions when analytic experience gets underway. To begin, yet again, let's summarize what we know about this Bard subjectivity that you see flitting through the discourse of the master and that of the analyst when the analysand gets going. At the risk of putting this too simply, and you know I'm always willing to take this risk, there are 4 key moments that I think we should consider. And again, all by way of review, and again, all in order to begin this conclusion. Here it is in a word, and then we'll break down each point into these 4 elements. Loss leads to the formation of the unconscious, which functions as a place of lack, around which the Bard subject takes place. So if you're watching this video, I'll hold up a finger every time we arrive at one of these key moments. Loss leads to the formation of the unconscious, which functions as a place of lack, around which the Bard subject takes shape. So you have these 4 constitutive moments that go into the production of that Bard subjectivity that is suppressed and silenced in the discourse of the master and speaks freely at the level of the symptom and that of the analyst. Like I said, though, let's slow down and take them one at a time, because I think that allows us to start tallying up some of the ones that Lacan has been dragging us through, in some cases, here in Seminar 19. Let's start first with loss, arguably the most familiar of the bunch. Here is the negative one, the minus phi, that we have so often discussed in lectures on Lacan. Here is the negative one of the father as that negative one who says no, whose prohibition, whose paternal function inaugurates the process of castration, of symbolic alienation, whatever you want to call this shit. Here is the original unigation of the father, if you read chapters 15 and 16 of Seminar 19 carefully. Here, I would add, is the no of the father qua unary trait. Now that ought to ring some bells for you. The unary trait in all of its incisional and inscriptive functions and effects. And that's very important here. The logic or the structure, the operational logic of loss that we have always discussed in here has been one of incisional, inscriptive function and effect. And I like this image of incision, cutting into, and inscriptive in the sense of carving into, a furrowing out. The function and the effect of loss occurs at the level of the incision, at the level of the inscription. This is crucial. I don't think Lacan has wavered in his thinking on this matter. This cutting in is crucial, as we saw in earlier discussions of pre-Oedipal imaginary triangles giving way to properly Oedipalized symbolic squares, if you recall that bit in our series. But it amounts to something quite simple, something that many of you have experienced in your everyday lives, not just when you were coming up. Between the child and the maternal figure, the function of the father is to cut in. Daddy always cuts in. Hence the -1, the -1 that I'm using here. The unary trait is the first one in the development of the subject, and it is a -1. That's the key point in all this. The unary trait. Think about it. Think about the work that we've done with that UN as negating in the German and the English, but also as oneifying at the level of the French un. The unary trait is the first one in Lacan's developmental sequence of the subject. And that first one is a -1 because it marks loss, a subtractive experience. And you know what happens next. This -1, as a numerical symbol for the start of castration, for the paternal function's first prohibitive moment, gets repressed, at least in the case of neurotic subjects. This -1 of loss of the unary trait, of thou shalt not, in turn gets repressed. The operational logic of this process is one of negation, in the classic Freudian sense, especially as Lacan mobilized it in the mid-1950s. That's where the good stuff on negation in Lacan comes up. Verneinung, the German term for negation that Freud uses in this wonderfully short little essay. It presupposes, according to Lacan in a careful and maybe heavy-handed reading of Freud, but accurate still, a Bejahung, an affirmation. Seminar 3 is a great place to start getting some good captions for this stuff. We've already been over all that, so this is just review. But here's how it works, you'll recall. In order to negate or deny or repress something, this something must first be symbolized, and its symbolization affirmed, acknowledged, and admitted. So in order to negate, you must first, or at least presuppose, an earlier affirmation. In order for me to tell you that the dream was not about my mother, I must first consider this possibility, affirming its existence, even if only as a possibility, and even if only primitively, presuppositionally. This is Freud's point around negation, and it's the same logic that is at work here when repression gets a hold of the unary trait. Whether we're talking about primal or secondary repression, this critique of negation, critique in the Kantian sense. Why do I say that? Again, Lacan is a Kantian in many ways because he's always looking at the presuppositional structures that allow for the existence of any given phenomenon. Here the phenomenon is negation, and there's a presuppositional logic. This is what critique does. What are the conditions of possibility for the dominance of white, propertied, masculine men in the West? That is a critical inquiry. And critique here of negation just means that we're asking about what has to happen or be in place in order for a negation to occur. Critique is a mode of inquiry that operates at the level of the presupposition. It asks what has to have happened in order for this particular phenomenon to pop. Here, we're asking about the affirmation that any given negation presupposes. So when we're talking about primal, secondary repression, this critique still holds because we're looking at the presuppositional logics, the operations that have to have occurred in order for a negation to take place. In order to further negate this unary trait, in order to, let's just say what it is, doubly negate the -1 of the unary trait, we must first positivize it, affirm its existence, and thus further oneify it. That's the move that we're shifting towards as we edge toward the unconscious. In order to further negate, repress, doubly negate the already -1 of loss of the unary trait of the no of the father, of castrative logic at its start, we must first positivize this experience. We must affirm this experience in order to negate it. We must acknowledge its existence. And in so doing, we further oneify this -1. Now, I know that's a little slippery, but the logic is really quite simple, and it goes like this. What, my friends, is the negation of -1? +1. The math is not more complicated than that. The negation of -1 is +1. That's the operation that we're looking at here. In order to repress the unary trait, it must be at some point along the way positivized, affirmed, acknowledged. Which brings us to that second moment, the one I just alluded to. The formation of the bard's subject presupposes the unconscious. Loss conditions the unconscious by way of repression. All review for us, but I cue it up because it's relevant here, as you'll see. When I say, as you've heard me say in recent series, that society begets the unconscious by way of castration and repression, it's this double negation you just heard me discussing that I have in mind. Repression further negates the already subtractive experience of loss known as castration. If you want it in a sentence, this is one I could live with. Repression further negates the already subtractive experience of loss known as castration. And let's just be a little arch with this since we are at the end of our series on Seminar 19. Repression makes nothing of this something, effectively zeroing out the -1 of prohibition. So yes, there's a positivization of that -1 in order for the negated work of repression to occur, but the effect is quite different. When repression gets a hold of that -1 and does its work of affirmation and negation, what results is a nothing made of this something known as the unary trait, effectively a zeroing out of the -1 of prohibition. That's what repression does. It zeroes out the unary trait. What then is the unconscious? It is the place, it is the site where nothing made of something can be seen. The unconscious is where this nothing made of something, this unary trait zeroed out, can be seen. And let me be precise again. The unconscious is the place where nothing appears, where this nothing shows up, where nothing can be seen. In fact, the unconscious is the place where there's nothing to see. And you know how Lacan sees this. The unconscious is the empty set, where loss gives way to lack, where the paternal "thou shalt not" becomes the subject's "there is not." You've heard me define 0 as the mathematical symbol of the empty set, and the latter as the place where 1 is missing, the place of a 1 that is not there. 1 minus 1 equals 0. You've also heard me say. This means that when you subtract 1 from itself, 1 is no longer there. Present, if it is, only as absent. It's missing, it's gone. In short, it's lacking. This is what becomes of the unary trait in the field of the unconscious. In castrative logics, hear me now, there is always something of the 1, even if only as a negative 1. But in the unconscious, there is nothing of this 1, negative or otherwise. And that's the difference between castration and the unconscious. In castrative logics, the unary trait, the no of the father, prohibition, symbolic alienation, call it whatever the fuck you want, there's always something of the 1. And this 1, I'm telling you, is a negative 1. It's a subtractive, incisional, indenting, inscriptive process experienced as a negative 1, as cut, as incision. But in the unconscious, there's nothing of this 1 left, negative, positive, otherwise. That motherfucker is gone. The unconscious is the place where 1 is missing, where negative 1 has been zeroed out. It's the place of a 1 that is no longer there. Now that's all good and well, and by God, if it's not fun as hell also to talk and think in these ways. But let's try and be clear, coherent, and accessible with this material. There may be nothing to see in the unconscious, but this doesn't make the unconscious itself nothing. But the kind of something that the unconscious is can only be seen indirectly by way of contrast with the subject that takes shape around it. And I think this is where things, unfortunately, get a little tangled. But this is a very important point to note. The kind of something that the unconscious is can only be seen indirectly by looking awry, if you will, in contrast, I think, with the subject that takes shape around this unconscious. As a site of lack in which nothing can be seen, and this is the third moment of the 4 that I began with here. Loss, the unconscious, and now we're arriving at lack. As a site of lack in which nothing can be seen, the unconscious functions much like a black hole, if you think about it. Think about how black holes work. More precisely, think about how they're observed. You can't look at a black hole and say, there it is. Black holes can only be observed indirectly. Why? Because these motherfuckers do not emit light. There is nothing to see in a black hole because they are so powerful that they suck light instead of radiating it. So how do we do this? Accretion disks of hot glowing gas and dust swirling around an otherwise dead zone, that tells us there's a black hole there. Gravitational effects on other objects near black holes. Black holes are powerful, so they produce odd gravitational effects around nearby celestial bodies. We can see those effects on those bodies and know that there's a black hole there. We can observe the black hole by studying what it isn't at the level of its immediate surroundings. And that's it, my friends. It's all about their immediate surroundings, not the black holes themselves. That's how we observe them. We know them where they're not. So also with the unconscious. We know the unconscious the same way we know black holes, where it is not. And I got a word for this. Whether it fits or not, I ask you to just think about it. We know black holes like we know the unconscious by way of their silhouettes. What exactly is a silhouette? It's the overall form or shape or contour, or whatever you want to call it, of something that we see when this thing is backlit or in shadow. We're talking about shapes without internal details, forms without specific features. This is a silhouette. You can run a simple internet search for silhouettes and see examples and be like, oh, got it, a shape without internal details, a form without specific features. Think about the subject who doesn't want their identity to be revealed in an interview, and the way that that subject is backlit such that you only see an outline of their head, their shoulders, but not the details of their face. That's a silhouette. But don't get this twisted. The unconscious is not its silhouette, nor is the subject who takes shape around the unconscious. Hear me now. The silhouette is the differential relation that becomes visible as the subject takes shape around the unconscious. Sound familiar? Ring a bell here? The symbol for this differential relation is the same as it's ever been. It's a little italicized A. And that little a is precisely what's at stake at the end of Seminar 19. Objet A is the silhouette of the unconscious that becomes visible in the formation of the Lacanian subject. I want to keep sharpening this stick. At the end of things, why the fuck not? At the risk of putting too fine a point again on this stick, here's what I would say. Loss finds its home in the unconscious, and the ensuing experience of lack finds its home in the subject. And all that bit about silhouettes is just to give you some precise ways of understanding how this works. Let's put it a bit more archly to keep the conversation going. In the unconscious, something becomes nothing. The -1 of castration slips into oblivion by way of repression. But in the subject, this structure that takes shape around the place where nothing can be seen, and in taking shape generates an outline of this place. Here in the subject, this nothing that the unconscious makes by way of repression of the something known as the unary trait, this nothing becomes itself something. So the -1 of castration slips into oblivion. But in the subject, this oblivion becomes a site of circumscription. You can trace the outline of this oblivion. The subject is the tracing of that outline that shows you where oblivion is. Here it is again. In the unconscious, something becomes nothing. But in the subject, this nothing becomes something. Note that logic. This is what I mean when I say the subject who originates from the unconscious also reproduces it, carrying it with them wherever they go, from one experience to the next. It's a stone cold piece of Lacan. This is not my insight. Ever. All of this shit just comes straight from Lacan. The subject is a something made of nothing. It's a one made out of the negative one that has been zeroed out in the unconscious. See that? The subject is something made of nothing. Yes, it's a one. It's another one for us to consider, but it's a one that is made out of other stuff. It's a one made out of the negative one that has itself been zeroed out in the unconscious. Something, the negative one of castration, is zeroed out, slipping into oblivion in the field of the unconscious. But this, in turn, becomes something around which the subject can be built. Now, the button that I'm pushing here is the one that I believe is the central button in Lacan's thinking around the one. Oneness, as ever, is a production. It is an operational result. It's not something that is. It's something that has to be made. E pluribus unum. Out of many things, many parts, a negative one zeroed out, you can then make one. But oneness is an effect. Oneness is a production, something made out of other stuff. You hear me? Multiplicity comes first. Now, were we to slow down a minute and just enumerate each of the four moments here, recalling our opening gambit about loss leading to the formation of the unconscious, which in turn functions as a place of lack around which the subject takes shape, spinning out objet A as the silhouette of the unconscious. Here's how I would do it. 1, loss, castration as negative one. 2, we have the unconscious as a zeroing out, an operational logic, as much as it is a place. 3, lack, objet A, qua zero. 4, the subject, barred S, as a one made out of zero. This zero. Isn't this what we've been talking about when we referred to the subject as a bag with a hole in it, straight from Seminar 19, as a oneification of zero, as a making of zero to count as one, if you read a Lambadieu, as a setification of the empty set. This is the conceptual and clinical foundation on which I'm building when I say the subject is a bag with a hole in it. In the subject, the classic Lacanian split subject, a something reduced to nothing becomes the condition of possibility for the emergence of something else. If you've got eyes to see, it's the fifth vector in the analytic discourse that we're tracing here. We ain't doing fancy work. We are just tracing that fifth vector in the analytic discourse from unconscious truth to barred subject. S2 to barred S. And I hold up again the analytic discourse so you can see that return arrow from S2 to barred subject. And you will know what comes next. From unconscious truth to barred subjectivity to symptomatic expression, that S1 in the position of product in the analytic discourse. So I will add that arrow as well and hold it up again for those of you watching. We are talking about S2 to barred subject to the production of S1 as symptom, same as we've ever been discussing here. At stake for Lacan in all of these ones and zeros, negated, positivized, oneified, and the like, is this paramount S1. Now again, this ain't the final one of Seminar 19, but I dare say it's been the central one. This S1, that is the symptom, that is the product of the analytic discourse. This S1 of the symptom. Note, we are not talking about the repressed, but its return. And again, we are thinking about this like good Kantians. The return of the repressed is what shows us, allowing us to presuppose and to flesh out retroeffectively what has happened up to that point. Isn't the return of the repressed precisely what the repressed is? Now, all of this is to say, up to this point, which is why we've spent so much time considering this S1 in the past 2 series of lectures on Lacan, this series as well. Here at the end of Seminar 19, in his report on the seminar, Lacan helps us account for its origins, the origin of this S1. And this report is fabulous. It's a wild little document at the end of the English translation of Seminar 19 that we've been considering. But it's actually quite useful in some of its precision. If the symptom is the monad produced by the nad of barred subjectivity, as we've established in this series, the unconscious, as S2 in the analytic discourse, is what Lacan calls now the inaccessible Hennad, H-E-N-A-D, that compels the subject to speak. So check that out. S2, Hennad, barred subject, nad. S1, monad. That's what's up with all the nad talk in Seminar 19. But hold up. What exactly is a Hennad? We get it in a footnote in Lacan's report on Seminar 19. A Hennad is the head or origin of a certain chain of causation, any chain of causation really. Apollo is the Hennad of all things Apollonian. Helios is the Hennad of, you can guess it, all things sunny. My point is, when we identify the unconscious as the Hennad that commands the nad of barred subjectivity to cough up the monad known as the symptom, what I'm saying is the unconscious is the Hennad of all subjectivities barred. It is the head or the origin, inaccessible, of a certain chain of causation, including the barred subject. Isn't this exactly how we arrived at the discourse of the hysteric? We talked about masters, we're talking about analysts. Let's throw the hysteric into this mix as well. From S2 to barred S to S1 in the analytic discourse, Hennad to nad to monad, to the proliferation of S1s, dialectized with S2s in that of the hysteric. That's been the sequence here. The unconscious commands the barred subject to cough up a symptom. And if the analysand can be properly hystericized, look at the discourse of the hysteric. They can now occupy the position of a barred subject, interrogating their symptoms and producing, by way of dialectization, connections to unconscious truths, truths that they need to become. And this whole process, you've heard me describe in recent lectures, is a rather joyous one. The hystericized analysand is someone who gets off on deciphering their monads, their symptoms, in relation to the unconscious truths that compelled them. But remember, I believe this is a joyfulness that is at once helpful in analytic experience, but also, ultimately, if it does not conclude, hazardous. But I didn't come here to talk to you about that. What I want to talk about is the word that we use for this joyful proliferation of decipherings by the hystericized analysand. From Hennad to nad to monad in the analytic discourse, S2 to barred subject to S1. To the hystericizations of the analysand in that of the hysteric. What do we see on the right-hand side of the discourse of the hysteric? What do we see with regard to that monad of the symptom? It all comes down to this. The discourse of the hysteric is a monadology. We've talked a bunch about Lacan's study of Aristotle, Frege, Cantor, in Seminar 19, but don't forget about Leibniz. He doesn't pop up much. In fact, I only found one reference to him in Seminar 19, but in Lacan's report on Seminar 19, by God, if that sequence doesn't end in a conversation about Leibniz, and a very relevant one to which we shall return shortly. All this stuff on Hennads, nads, and monads, the unconscious as a Hennad, at the head of a causation that includes the nad of barred subjectivity, who in turn coughs up the monad. There's that S1, that monad that is the symptom. All of this culminates in what we can call a monadology. Remember, it's Leibniz that Lacan has his eye on here. Clinically, I think we see this in the hystericization of the analysand. The discourse of the hysteric when it occurs in analytic experience is monadological, through and through. Think about the roots of this. You have your monad coupled with the Greek notion of logos, the very word, the only word truly in Greek that means discourse. But you could say the same thing about Lacan's work on the one in Seminar 19, which is why I'm hitting this monadological nail on the head multiple times. It's a radical upending of Leibnizian monadology. That is what is up with Seminar 19. I told you it's about the one. It's not about men, it's not about women, it's not about masculine, feminine, it's not about sexuation, it's about the one. And the one that Lacan is starting to rile up here is a one that marks a radical upending of the modern monadological approach that we get from Leibniz. Now, I know some of you all don't read philosophy, and that's just fine. But in Lacan's report, he is asking you to consider Leibniz in the midst of all this, and that is precisely what we're doing. Psychoanalysts, y'all like to talk about symptomatology. That's cool. That's great. It works great. Symptomatology. Fabulous. But I think if you're a reader of Lacan, you would be better served to call this talk what it is, monadology. This is what we see in the discourse of the hysteric, and I think this is what we should be doing when we think symptomatologically. Thankfully, and I say that genuinely, thankfully, the monad known as the symptom does not culminate in the monadology of the hystericized analysand. And not just because the discourse of the hysteric does not mark the end of analysis. And this, my friends, is the turning point at the end of Seminar 19. Note, what happens to the Hennad turned nad turned monad in the discourse of the analyst? I'll use a different color marker to show you. S1 points back to the analyst as objet A. And this will be the last time we refer to the analyst here as objet A, object little a.